China's built up a bit of a bad reputation for blatantly copying a lot of things from other places. Games are no exception, as over the years we've seen a lot of copied games from China, namely in the mobile space. And that isn't to say everything that comes from there is bad. They definitely have the potential to make great games and have made great games in the past, but that doesn't exactly wash away the negative connotation that comes from Chinese game developers. A recent attempt from the Chinese developer MiHoYo to enter the console gaming space sparked some controversy for its resemblance to Breath of the Wild. They first showed off the gameplay footage of Genshin Impact at the China Joy Gaming Expo and immediately received a slew of backlash from people checking out the game. A few Twitter users tweeted out about how there's a lot of familiar elements, including music, and showed a few side-by-side screenshots. And I'm gonna be honest here and say that some of these screenshots seem like a bit of a stretch. Take the screenshots of the fire and swimming, for instance. I'm not entirely convinced they're stealing fire or swimming mechanics from Breath of the Wild. They aren't exactly the first ones to include these in games. I mean, come on, it's fire and swimming. I also feel like the enemies shooting lasers are a bit of a stretch as well, because to me, it just seems like any other enemy shooting a laser. Again, not exactly something new, but I will say that this last comparison does seem slightly suspicious. They're not exactly one-to-one copies, but there are some similarities with the design of the limbs and whatnot, so I will give them that. Anyway, at China Joy, Zelda fans started protesting the game by taking pictures of themselves holding their Switch console or a copy of Breath of the Wild while flipping off the Genshin Impact display at the Sony booth. Normally, something like this wouldn't exactly get a ton of traction, especially when it's not at a major event like E3 or PAX. But what really made the whole situation take off was a guy who went ahead and smashed his PS4. Now, there's a bit more to this story than most coverage of this event have really talked about. Most people took this as a bunch of angry Zelda fans getting mad at a game copying Breath of the Wild, and while that's partly the case, Kotaku reader Cloud Lu brought some really great insight about the situation. Basically, the big takeaway was that people were more so protesting how heavily Sony was promoting and featuring Genshin Impact, which they felt was a blatant ripoff of the game. In this comment, Cloud Lu states that console games were banned for 10 years in China, so Chinese gamers struggled to push for support of console games. And eventually they succeeded and consoles were allowed in, but due to the nature of game corporations essentially ripping off a lot of games from overseas, a lot of their community is pretty sensitive to stuff like this. There's definitely a good reason for Chinese gamers to get upset about copycat games and Sony pushing them to this extent, but I can't say I support the type of protest they went with. I feel the way they did it was a bit immature and could have been handled much better in my opinion, and the most effective protest is protesting with your wallet, although I can totally understand that it's difficult to get enough people to do this to an extent where it would be effective. And I don't know if smashing your PS4 is a good way to protest this either, because I mean, Sony already has your money from when you bought it. In fact, it seems like he achieved the exact opposite of what he intended, because it brought a lot of attention to the game and people actually seem really interested in it. As for whether or not I think this is a blatant ripoff of Breath of the Wild, I'm still pretty skeptical. While there's definitely some influence, I feel like there's enough unique stuff for it to be its own standalone thing. You got waifus, you got a variety of different characters and playstyles, unique skills and abilities, and it looks like a solid game. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments, and while you're doing that, get subscribed, and I'll see you in the next video.